Right, so good afternoon, everyone, and hi to those who are watching from home. I'm happy to see a crowded room again. Please, those in the back, if you can also try to come forward so that if more people will arrive later, there will be some spaces. There are still some empty chairs here in the first rows. And my name is Rita Lucarelli. I'm an associate professor of Egyptology at the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures. And today I'd like to welcome everyone to the second lecture of our teaching series, Let's Talk About Palestine. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Hatem Bazian and Dr. Kate Feldman, and our moderator, Dr. Ussama Makdisi. Dr. Hatem Bazian is a decolonial scholar who centers Islam's epistemology in all his work and examines the contemporary world through a global South lens. With 5 books, numerous chapters, peer-reviewed journal articles, hundreds of press articles, and constant academic contributions and engagement across the globe, Bazian is known as an organic intellectual, a term used for scholars who directly connect their work and scholarship to people and are not confined to academia's constructed walls of separation. Bazian is a leading scholar in the Islamophobia studies field, having founded the Islamophobia Studies Center, editor-in-chief of the Islamophobia Studies Journal, and co-founder and current president of the International Islamophobia Studies and Research Association. And Bazian also co-founded Zaytuna College, the first accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the United States, and is a lecturer in the departments of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures and Asian Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Kate Feldman is an associate professor of ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where he also serves as department chair. And Dr. Feldman's research program takes cultural studies approaches to theorize and narrate the interface between race, culture, knowledge, and state power. His work explores race as a master category and as a medium by crafting comparative, relational, intersectional, and transnational analysis situated in localized and embodied context. Feldman is the author of A Shadow Over Palestine, The Imperial Life of Race in America, as well as more than 24 articles and book chapters in Palestine studies, critical ethnic studies, and transnational American studies. A Shadow Over Palestine received also the 2017 Best Book in Humanities and Cultural Studies from the Association for Asian American Studies and was a finalist for the American Studies Association's 2016 Laura Romero First Book Publication Prize. Dr. Feldman is also one of the faculty co-organizers of The Color of New Media, a working group sponsored by the Center for Race and Gender and the Berkeley Center for New Media that focuses on intersections of critical race theory, gender and women studies, and transnational studies with new media studies. And finally, Dr. Ussama Makdisi is professor of history and chancellor's chair at University of California, Berkeley, and is the author of multiple award-winning books, the most recent being Age of Coexistence, The Ecumenical Frame, and the Making of the Modern Arab World. Today's talk is entitled Islamophobia, Race, and the Racialization of Palestine, and we'll discuss how the concept of racism is critical for apprehending the conditions of livability in Palestine and for Palestinians. We would like to remind you also that all events in the Let's Talk About Palestine teaching series are live streamed on our departmental Facebook page and YouTube channel that you can Google, looking for MELC, Middle Eastern Languages and Culture Department, and are coordinated indeed by our department and co-sponsored by the Department of Ethnic Studies, the Department of Rhetoric, the Program in Critical Theory, the International Consortium of Critical Theory Programs, and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. If you have questions, please write them down on the slip of paper that you should have found on your chair. If you did not find it, there are more here. We will collect all your questions soon after the lectures. And finally, we invite you also to join us for the remaining 2 events in the series, all held at 4 p.m. in this very room. On March 14, Samira Esmeir and Wadi Said will present on apartheid, occupation, and the law, followed by a conversation moderated by Hatem Bazian. And on April 16, Ahmad Diab and Stefania Pandolfo will present on Palestinian literature and the writing of trauma, followed by a conversation moderated by Mohammed Wajib Ben Ahmed. And it's time to leave the stage to our speakers. Welcome.
Palestinians are the last of the modern colonial subjects. They are the victims of racism, discrimination on a daily basis. Their very existence is denied by many. Their culture is belittled. Their history is distorted. These are the words of Edward Said. He also adds, the struggle for Palestinian liberation is fundamentally a fight against the dehumanization forces of colonialism and racism, which seek to erase their identity and rights. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. So today's joint lecture is entitled Islamophobia, Race, and the Racialization of Palestine. Myself, I will speak on Orientalism, Islamophobia, and the dehumanization of Palestinians. Islamophobia is a variety of Orientalism that can be understood within the framework of Said's trilogy, covering Islam, Orientalism, and the question of Palestine, which I insist must be read in conversation. A second part in my talk will link to Jack Shaheen's work on real bad Arabs and the long trajectory of demonization of Arabs, Muslims, and in particular Palestinians that form the basis and the content of Said's latent Orientalism. In the last part of my talk, I'll transition to the war on terror that develops the infrastructure of perpetual war, of global reach, and the contemporary civilizational mission with the Palestinian posited as the unredeemable, archetypal, and persistent protagonist to all the good things that Western triumphalism offers. Here, Israel and Zionism role in the post-Cold War era as the frontline state keeping the barbarians outside the gate of civilizations. Yet we don't know where the gate is. If not better, as we currently see, to be totally removed from the earth altogether in Gaza and other places. Let me offer just definition for Orientalism for those who don't know. Orientalism is a manner of regularized or orientalized writing, vision, and study dominated by imperatives, perspectives, and ideological biases ostensibly suited to the Orient. It is really the image of the Orient. Second, let me give you a definition of Islamophobia, which we work with in the Center for Race and Gender here at Berkeley. Islamophobia is a structural organizing tool located at the contemporary racial, gender, and class crossroads. It is employed to rationalize, extend, and reinvigorate Western power hierarchies while embarking on a project for silencing the global other. Often people, when they think about Islamophobia, they think that it's a discussion about Islam rather than the racialization of Muslims as it relates to Islam. So in this sense, when we say Muslim in the contemporary period or Islam, it should be understood as a racial category due to the process of racialization. Three of Said's books are timely today as the day they were published almost 6 years ago: Orientalism, Question of Palestine, and Covering Islam. The three constitute Said's trilogy that focus on the literary and artistic representation in service of empire, colonial dispossession, and media shaping and reproducing Orientalist tropes. Said offers a strong critique of Western policies and public discourses that purport to cover the East as a separate and mysterious place filled with irrationality. I guess they didn't go to Washington. The three books can help in deciphering the rising tide of Islamophobia, a variety of Orientalism, and the entrenched, latent, and manifest animus directed at the Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian subject in contemporary discourses. Now, a second as just important work is Jack Shaheen's Real Bad Arabs, which analyzes about 1,000 American films that vilify and stereotype Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims. Among these, many of us possibly have watched Aladdin, which Shaheen reportedly walked out when it was actually first presented. At the time, Shaheen spoke out against the lyrics in the film opening song, "I come from a land from a faraway place, where they cut off your ear if they don't like you, if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home." Although he convinced Disney to remove the lyrics for the home video release, the final verse was still there. "It's barbaric, but hey, it's home." As a 1993 op-ed in New York Times wrote, "It's racist, but hey, it's Disney." Mainstream media and film production create latent Orientalism, Islamophobia, and in particular, anti-Palestinianism. Then activate into policy whenever any event or series of events emerge that propaganda makes it resemble the manufactured image in our Hollywood production. Like Said, Shaheen rightly observed, Muslim and Arab stereotypes have existed since well before the advent of cinema in 18th and 19th century European artists and writers. They caricatured the Middle East as full of desolate deserts, corrupt palaces, and heathen Arabs. In particular, the hugely popular Arabian Nights stories allowed fictional rendition of wild foreigners, exotic concubines, and slave bazaars to become real depictions and an indelible part of our culture. For Hollywood, mainstream media and embedded intellectuals, Arabs and Muslims have always been the cultural other, seen as different, as threatening in terms of race and religion, and depicted as brutal, heartless, uncivilized religious fanatics bent on terrorizing civilized Westerners. Shaheen reminds us that in the mid-1980s, filmmaking the production company Canon, formed by the producers of Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus, the Israeli director of the film industry department, who teamed up to make 26 hate and terminate the Arab movies, including Hell Squad and the Delta Force, both of which featured Palestinian villains. One can hardly find any positive or redeemable Palestinian character across the 20th century Hollywood and media production. This is precisely the construction of latent Orientalism and Islamophobia. More than half of the Palestinian movies or the anti-Palestinian movies were released in the 1980s and 90s. 19 from 1983 to 1989. 9 from 1990 to 1998. Absent from Hollywood's Israeli-Palestinian movies are human dramas revealing Palestinians as normal folks. Computer specialists, domestic engineers, farmers, teachers, poets, and artists. Never do movies present Palestinians as innocent victims. Well, they can't be. And Israelis as brutal oppressors. They never were in Western imagination. Think of Piers Morgan, if anybody knows this personality, taunting and bullying every guest to utter a condemnation before being allowed to speak, to understand the impact of latent Orientalism. Just recall any Western reporter ever asking an Israeli spokesperson to condemn the killing of a single Palestinian. Have you heard a single Western reporter asking for a condemnation of the assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh? 116 other journalists murdered in Gaza, 166 university professors. Never in our wildest imagination such a cadre of Western reporters will utter a word asking for condemnation. It's not surprising, while it should be, that the media, the political elites, university leadership, and intellectuals to immediately respond and believe every outrageous claim put forth by the Israeli government, the IDF, and its massive Hasbara network. They are only activating the already existent latent content on Palestinians and everything related to the Arab and Muslim worlds. It is clear at this moment, despite so much written material and an avalanche of content on the Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians, we still recycle some of the most racist, despicable depictions of people while witnessing a live-streamed genocide. Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims are invariably stereotyped as murderers, rapists, all-rich dimwits, abusers of women, and jihadists. You could add to this list black beards, headdresses, dark sunglasses, oases, hook noses, belly dancers, limousine, harem maidens, oil wells, camels, I like camels, automatic weapons, and then never to forget, you cannot say intifada, from the river to the sea, Allahu Akbar, right? And most recent entry, watermelons. The sweet fruit is triggering for being naturally aligned to a free Palestine is something that we are witnessing these days. To be honest, in preparing for this talk, I was tempted to begin by quoting from New York Times Thomas Friedman's Understanding the Middle East Through the Animal Kingdom. But I refrained from doing so since the column says more about his abode than the homes, places, or soul of my soul people that he constantly demonizes. Gaza today, one is at a loss to comprehend the sheer destruction and the sniffing out of hope faced by 2 million people. No food, no water, no medicine. For the Amalek, a call for genocide, closed entry and exit with total silence and complicity of most of the Western world and their client Arab and Muslim allies. So what is at work in here? Racism is the old and well-tested Western machine that situates Palestinians below the line of the human. I will quote my colleague Ramon Grasfugel on this point. The people classified above the line of the human are recognized socially in their humanity as human beings, and thus enjoy access to rights, human rights, civil rights, women's rights, and or labor rights, material resources, and social recognition to their subjectivities, identities, epistemologies, and spiritualities. The people below the line of the human are considered subhuman or non-human. That is, their humanity is questioned and as such negated. Many of us are almost constantly doing the exercise of calling on the international community, calling on the 4 Geneva Convention, calling on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, calling on the country club, the United Nations Security Council, to no avail, because we are at fault thinking that we are human, thus deserving human rights, not recognizing that we inhabit below the line of the human. Said analysis almost 20 years ago, and writing intuitively deconstructed the racialized lens used by Western academics, the press, and policymakers to justify their continued disregard for the needs and well-being of the Palestinians. But one can also add all Arab and Muslims in this sense. Arabs and Muslims can perish in the Mediterranean Sea and English Channel daily, and no one cares or even thinks it's a human calamity because those dying don't look like the high-quality brand of humans coming from the Ukraine. Do we really mourn the subhuman when they die? Do we know their names? recall their hopes, dreams, and aspirations? Do we have a full montage on CNN, ABC, NBC, not Fox, of the type of life that these individuals lived and what was lost by their death? The unfolding genocide in Gaza provides an appropriate time to bring Said's view into play to understand the deepening crisis in the region. Even before Gaza, what should be our response and commentary on the events? Again, and I list, not for exhaustive purposes, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Sudan, Somalia, Kashmir, and Yemen. And what line of analysis should we pursue? Yes, today we're dealing with Palestine, but how many of us actually remember the names of the Iraqis that perished? Or the names of those in Afghanistan from 1979 to just yesterday? Should we blame it was the Taliban? Or should we actually think of the imperial world that used Afghanistan as the landscape to settle their own account? Just like today, settling the accounts on the Syrian landscape. Yes, Syrians can be seen as violent, but the United States is there, NATO is there, Russia is there, much of the Arab world have their forces there, and as such we need to have a correct view and analysis of the situation. It's important to recall that Said's Orientalism covering Islam and the question of Palestine emerged around and in the aftermath of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Lebanese Civil War, and the Iranian Revolution. Does it sound familiar? The same areas facing intervention and demonization today. It is because the people inhabit the subhuman, or is it the region that continue to offer the oil, the gas, the resources, as well as the trade routes that facilitate our domination? Israel and Zionism are a variety of Western settler colonialism. It acts and responds within the same supremacist, exceptionalist epistemic violence, ethnic cleansing, transfer, and genocide. These are normative, not exceptional. A cursory examination of Western history and thought is sufficient illustration. Post 9/11, Western academics and press reports focus on the now, just like the crop of contemporary Orientalist and Islamophobic practitioners that cover the unfolding events in Gaza. The disintegration of Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen was presented without context and no examination of the long road that led to the current condition. So history begins on October 7th for everyone, and it becomes the mark of meaning, humanity, empathy, ethics, and for sure, revengeful violence. 9/11 became a mark of history. What happened before is immaterial. What happened after is seen as justified. All those who come out of their settler colonial caves, and we have many in this area, are writing and reporting on the subject matter as if they are dealing with an animal lab, operating clinically to describe the small and big movement without ever asking how, why, and what stimuli brought this about. Critically, many who write, report, and examine developments in Palestine do so from the comfortable distance of a Western capital, a secure think tank with Orientalist thinking inside the tank, a university post with graduate students to translate the difficult native language, and even when on rare occasion they make it to the high-end hotels in a given conflict zone, they never venture beyond its confines and the few cafes or bars that cater to their fine taste. On this occasion, the Israeli side of the border and as embedded experts. Notice not a single Western press agency is reporting from inside Gaza. Let me repeat. Not a single Western press agency is reporting from inside Gaza, the center of the global crisis today, but yet not a single Western press agency is actually made it to the ground. You have a better chance actually covering Mars than actually covering Gaza. CNN made it for a few hours, but that's it. Reported on a Shifa behind an Israeli tank, for sure. For Western colonial media in Gaza, the lens of the camera is indistinguishable from the sniper's scope. For Western colonial media in Gaza, the lens of the camera is indistinguishable from the sniper's scope. One kills the child with a bullet. The media erases the child from our collective consciousness. What would Said say about the ongoing carnage, both the physical and, more importantly, the mental disfiguration masquerading as sound academic research and intellectual pursuits? Despite the passing of almost 45 years since Said's monumental works and hundreds, if not thousands of papers, articles, editorials, conferences, and special reports about what we broadly call Palestine, the political elite has learned and applied less of what supposedly was studied. They are incapable. We care less about the lives and experiences of Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians today than the time that Edward Said put pen to paper to produce his works. Also, the new crop of Orientalists, and there are many of them these days, which has a new category of the Muslim Zionists, which we need also to understand. Let me say, the new crop of Orientalists, which has a new category of Muslim Zionists that cuts its bloodied shark teeth on war on terrorism funding and reforming Islam, reforming the Arab mind, reforming Palestinian society, think tank of embedded intellectuals, which have developed the habit of critiquing Said's work and blaming him for supposed failures in Palestine, the region, and setting in motion the so-called victimhood mentality. Misrepresenting Said has become the norm, and many who have not read him, nor the connected thread of scholarship that his work emerges from and converse with throughout his career. The trilogy of misrepresentation is found among media talking heads, empire-embedded academics, and political elites who daily leash a barrage of obfuscation, distortion, and sensationalization of Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims. Current movies, books, and public discourses have repackaged every Orientalist trope and distortion into a new Islamophobic and racist entertainment industry that feasts on a heavy dose of the racialized Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim figure as the all-encompassing evil, villain threatening life itself. Existing and newly formed academic fields with a plethora of embedded intellectuals have helped refine and produce the new crop of Orientalists who are committed to documenting the Palestinian Arab Muslim subject as best as she can never imagine, and then offered a manifest destiny to bring civilization to the purported subhuman. Said's focus on the role of the intellectual is pertinent today. Now, I think Ussama will agree, we have not heard any of the liberal intellectual elite speak on anything pertaining to Gaza. I guess they're busy speaking about hugging the trees, which I like them to do. So Said's focus on the role of the intellectual is pertinent today since embedded academics are feasting on empire's trough, filled with grants and projects intended to study the exotic Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim subject, to understand its proclivity to violence and resistance. You should not be able to resist, right? Indeed, the role of the intellectual has been eroded due to the encroachment of power, capitalism, and the narrowly constructed interests that pass for academia today. The refined sophistry and preoccupation with access to power circles, funding, and upward institutional mobility have laid waste to the university in its current configuration. The Orientalist imaginary still captured the minds of many a dreamer of grandeur in the West, and a campaign afoot to discover, document, and civilize the East for their humanness necessitate the never-ending intervention. Said Orientalists of the past have produced an emboldened crop that utilizes an ideological and material shock and awe. So let me repeat. Orientalism of the past have produced an embedded crop that utilizes an ideological and material shock and awe epistemic to civilize the barbarians at the gates of civilizations. Flattening Gaza is the same shock and awe that was pushed for Iraq and Afghanistan. Now let me shift the conversation to the last section of my talk, War on Terror, and I will also link it to the clash of civilization discourse to make the loop and the circle. The grotesque crafted binary at foot of Bernard Lewis's thesis, Clash of Civilization, have found a new emboldened lease on life and a cadre of polished salesmen and saleswomen who have taken to the airwaves to frame, rally, and poison public sentiments. Said wrote about the clash of ignorance in response to Lewis's and Huntington's initial thesis. But today their ideas are driving elite policies and infecting public sentiments on replacement theory and blaming critical race theory for every ill in society. Maybe they should read first the critical race theory and Said just for beginners. Huntington and his ignorant embedded intellectuals frame it this way, and I want you to pay attention to this framing. This is page 20 in Huntington book. There can be no true friends without true enemies. Unless we hate what we are not, we cannot love what we are. Let me repeat, page 20, Huntington. There can be no true friends without true enemies. Unless we hate what we are not, we cannot love what we are. I know he missed Valentine's Day last week. He's excused because he's vested in hate. Right? Now this means unless we hate the Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians, we cannot love what we are. So again, to understand, this means unless we hate the Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians, we could add other categories, we can't love what we are. I'm afraid to say that ignorance in this case is not bliss, is deadly dangerous. Understood correctly, Huntington Clash of Civilization thesis is a call to affirm the worldview of the West, or more accurately, the United States, by drawing clear distinctions from the Islamic and Sinic civilizations. Here, the Chinese, Muslims, and Islam subjects, which are laser focused on the Palestinians, are instruments to forge an internal cohesion in the US that in Huntington's mind is missing at present and is needed to maintain and extend America's power and domination. Not surprisingly, Huntington's follow-up book framed the problem as one of diversity. Again, the attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and asserted that the perceived Western weakness is due to multiculturalism, which in its essence, he said, is anti-European civilization. It is basically an anti-Western ideology. His words. In Who Are We? Huntington is framing it as a question and answering it by problematizing the increasing presence of Mexicans in the United States, muchas gracias, and viewing them as a threat to maintaining the cohesive nature of the country due to various factors that prevent assimilation into the American society. Taken together, Clash of Civilization and Who Are We provide an ideological blueprint for a new conceptualization of the problem that have beset right-wing and conservative agenda since the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements. Precisely the emergence of Clash of Civilization thesis allowed for the state, the far right counter-jihad movement, the neoconservative movement, sizable segments of the transnational Zionist movement, Arab and Muslim despots, and assorted liberal groupings, Bill Maher, including the pro-war left and the new atheist movement to unleash a barrage of Islamophobic discourses to rationalize the New World Order and their central role in countering it. Palestinians occupy the center stage in this Western psychological self-exploration to locate itself. You may say it's a 12-step, multifaceted genocidal therapy to reverse a loss of confidence in Western civilization. Here, Islamophobia becomes an ideological funnel. Through it, international and domestic alliances and coalitions are formed, whereby participants use Palestinians, Arabs, Islam, and Muslim subjectivities as the foil to array their varied political, economic, and military interests. All the forces mentioned above produce materials to saturate political circles, media coverage, and public discourses to the exclusion or marginalization of the voices that are not committed to this framing. Sometimes it's very difficult to decipher who's actually producing the material. Again, thinking about the doxing trucks that are around, there are many lies. These are big ticket item to actually lay out across the country just to understand all the different participants. Trump rhetoric is the crude version of the sophisticated dawns of academia and the Orientalist think tank industrial complex. So Trump's rhetoric is the crude version of the sophisticated dawns of academia and the Orientalist think tank industrial complex that spit up fabrication from the distant past, but in more polished and well-edited versions. And I'm not leaving Genocide Joe in here, so just don't think I'm critiquing only Trump. The engines of clash of civilization took shape early with Palestine, the Arab and Muslim world serving as the testing ground. Many tend to think that the war on terror and the demonization of Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims begins after 9/11. But in reality, one can go all the way back to the Crusades, the Inquisition, and 1492. But I will spare you a long rendition of all the events since then. I will spare you by only coming all the way to Reagan's targeting of Palestinian activists in 1987, in what became known as the LA8 case that lasted until 2007. Again, from 1987 to 2007, with Judge Einhorn writing in the decision, attention of these proceedings is a festering wound on the body of these respondents and an embarrassment to the rule of law. Now, the LA8 case made it to the Supreme Court and provided one of the most atrocious rulings that made a distinction between citizens and resident aliens. So resident aliens do not enjoy the constitutional protection. That is the direct outcome of the LA8 case. To give you context on the LA8 case, I organized to support the case during my undergraduate college years as a student at San Francisco State. And in 2016, while lecturing about the case in my Islam in America class, I got a student raising his hand stating that Khadr, one of the defendants, is his father. Right? So just to see the trajectory of a case that lasted almost 30 years. Clinton's 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which declared a U.S. state of emergency after events in Palestine. Clinton set in motion the infrastructure. Oh, thank you. I will skip this. I'm just going to go to my conclusion. So, the colonially nurtured Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim ruling elites are still suckling on the metaphorical colonial bosoms, administering punishment to their own population and fomenting wars against neighboring states so as to keep the global military-industrial machine humming at their expense. Death machines are machines that are made to be sold to cause death, and war is a business, and the business of war is war itself. Said would lament the cowardice of the intellectuals, the vanity of the political elites, and the arrogance of the powerful who set the world ablaze in pursuit of wealth and total domination. Palestine will be free despite the silence of the intellectuals, the complicity of the powerful, and the cheerleading of the propagandists, because the meek shall inherit the earth. And I see all of them today across the globe, out in the millions, the supermajority of everyday people that make history. Let's go forth, continue to dream of a free Palestine, organize for a free Palestine, and never stop speaking for a free Palestine. Thank you.
Greetings, everybody, and thank you so much, Dr. Bazian. Note to self, never go after Dr. Bazian. So, thank you all very much for coming. Thanks to the organizers, to Nora, to Rita, to Adam, to the Department of Middle East Languages and Cultures, and to all the co-sponsors today. Thanks also to Hatem, to Ussama for the opportunity to talk with you in public. And thanks to all of you gathered here on this rainy day, and all of you zooming in or streaming in from wherever you might be. So I'd like to begin today with the opening editorial from a 1983 issue of the renowned Quarterly Review of the Black Freedom Movement, a journal called Freedom Waves, a journal edited by some of the luminaries of the Black freedom struggle in the latter part of the 20th century. The editorial is penned by Jack H. Odell, a longtime editor, writer, scholar, and movement strategist. It's entitled, "The Silence is Broken." Odell writes, quote, "For several years now," this is 1983, "for several years now, we have witnessed a growing effort on the part of the United States public to understand and influence foreign policy issues. This is one of the byproducts of the Vietnam experience, when the practice of deception by government officials registered with the citizenry a deep and well-founded suspicion that foreign policy is conducted behind their backs. No area of U.S. foreign policy demonstrates this more thoroughly than does the conduct of our nation's relations with the peoples of the Middle East. Public inquiry into this area has been roundly discouraged. It's too complicated for the public to understand, say the experts. When this does not deter, there are always those who stand ready to smear with the charge of anti-Semitism any effort to find out the facts concerning the roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict." Odell continues, "After many years, it can be accurately stated that the silence has been broken," end quote. So 4 decades later, speaker series like this one, like the one on Thinking from Palestine, also taking place this semester on this campus, like those countless series taking place online and on campuses across the United States, suggest that the silence is continually breaking. So what might we hear? Between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea sits a place sometimes called Israel/Palestine. The typographical slash between these utterly non-equivalent proper names belies both the ongoing entanglement and the sharp dividing lines that shape this place's deeply unequal life worlds. I want to suggest today that an attunement to the concepts of race and state racism clarifies how the history, policies, and practices of the State of Israel have produced vertiginously disparate life chances for its citizens and subjects. It's worth underscoring that to talk about Palestine has for decades meant talking about state racisms, their transit and transformation across contexts, their impact in distinct yet interconnected settings, and the forms of theory, knowledge, and practice enacted to contest their deadly effects. The last decade has witnessed a flourishing of this work, tracing the racialized connections of state-sanctioned violence whose conditions have given rise to what Noura Erakat and Mark Lamont Hill call Black Palestinian transnational solidarity. Scholars such as Michael Fishback, Alex Lubin, Robin D.G. Kelly, Hamza Beg, Sophia Azeb, Nadia Al-Ahmed, and myself, among others, have surfaced the ways such work draws from and transforms practices of international solidarity articulated since at least the 1960s. One need look no further than the remarkable activity of Berkeley's one-time lecturer and editor of the Black Panther Intercommunal News Service, David Graham Du Bois. David Graham Du Bois, pictured here on the right with his mother, Shirley Graham Du Bois, in Cairo in front of the pyramids of Giza. David Graham Du Bois, the stepson of the great philosopher of Black freedom, W.E.B. Du Bois, who spent the 1960s living in Cairo as an English language journalist, and who spent much of the 1970s in Oakland, making legible for American audiences the connections between anti-colonial struggles, for Palestine, and struggles against racism in the United States. One need look no further than the upsurge of scholarship and activism in the wake of Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon and the massacres that ensued in the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. The series of essays published in Freedom Ways that I mentioned just a moment ago. The searing interventions by Arab American feminists like Carol Haddad, Aziza Al-Hibri, Elaine Hagopian, among others, who worked with the Women of Color Caucus at the 1982 meeting of the National Women's Studies Association to put forward a resolution condemning what the resolution called Israel's genocidal incursion into Lebanon, or Haddad's own remarks about anti-Arab racism at the NWSA plenary session that year, alongside the likes of Chela Sandoval, Gloria Anzaldúa, Nellie Wong, Bell Hooks, and Carol Lee Sanchez. One can find plainly in the print publication of the November 29th Solidarity Coalition, called Palestine Focus, founded in the Bay Area in 1982, calling out US and Israeli leaders, Reagan and Begin, great rhyme, partners in racism, reads one early headline. All Americans who fight against racism and for democracy, the op-ed says, need to examine the relationship between US foreign policy and domestic discontent. Supporting the rights of Palestinian people to self-determination, equality, and a homeland must be taken up by people seeking to eliminate all forms of racism, end quote. One need look no further than November 1982 to the poetry reading with Arab, American, and Israeli poets to raise funds for Palestinian children in Lebanon, hosted in New York City, co-organized by and featuring the Black feminist, poet, essayist, and teacher, and of course, future Berkeley faculty member, June Jordan, whose poem, Moving Towards Home, bears powerful witness as an engine to imagine beyond the daily evisceration of ordinary Palestinian existence. In short, to speak of Palestine has long meant reckoning with the theory, the concept, and the practice of state racism. And to do so, not only from within the United States. In February 1965, the Palestine Liberation Organization founded the Palestine Research Center, Markaz el-Abath al-Filistani. Based in Beirut, the PRC was a major conduit for publishing, archiving, and distributing knowledge germane to Palestine's national life and culture. Its directors were among the period's leading writers on Palestine, including the historian Anis Saeg, the attorney and researcher Sabri Jiris, and the poet Mahmoud Darwish. Between 1965 and 1982, the Palestine Research Center produced over 400 monographs, pamphlets, and maps in Arabic, English, French, and Spanish, as well as the quarterly periodical Shu'un Filistiniya, or Palestine Affairs. Early publications covered topics ranging from the Palestine question in international law, to civil rights under occupation, to US policy toward an Arab-Israeli arms race. One journalist likened the PRC's library to, quote, an ark containing the Palestinians' heritage, end quote, housing at its height approximately 25,000 bound volumes, alongside a broad swath of documentation germane to life in Palestine prior to 1948, from land deeds and photographs to cartographic documentation of many Palestinian villages present at the time of Israel's founding. In September 1982, the PRC offices were looted by Israel during its military invasion of West Beirut. The building's infrastructure was demolished by a fatal car bomb in early 1983, and many of its holdings were returned as part of a prisoner exchange in 1983. The Palestine Research Center was initially run by Fayez Sayegh, then a political science professor at American University of Beirut, before it was turned over to his brother Anis. Fayez Sayegh was born in Haraba, Syria in 1922. He grew up in Palestine before leaving in 1947 for the United States, where he earned a PhD in philosophy with a minor in political science at Georgetown University. He later held teaching positions at Yale, Stanford, Oxford, Macalester, and AUB. He served in the Lebanese, Yemeni, and Kuwaiti delegations at the UN before becoming the chief of the Arab States delegation. From 1968 until his death in 1980, he was the rapporteur for the UN Special Committee established under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Many of the PRC's publications had a critical bearing on the strategic production of knowledge by and about Palestinians, Arabs, and the historical conditions under which the Palestine question had emerged. The long-form Palestine Monographs series opened with Sayegh's own Zionist colonialism of Palestine, published in English, French, and Arabic simultaneously in September 1965. The central thrust of this pamphlet focuses on how the, quote, fate of Palestine represents an anomaly, end quote, in the wake of World War II. Sayegh writes, "The fading out of a cruel and shameful period of world history has coincided with the emergence at the land bridge between Asia and Africa of a new offshoot of European imperialism and a new variety of racist colonialism," end quote. Sayegh narrates the result of this anomaly in the tragedy of indigenous Palestinians losing both their land and their right to self-determination. He theorizes the logic of this dispossession as predicated on a theory of racism, animating what he calls the Zionist settler state. Sayegh draws on an archive of state building to identify Zionism's racial doctrines of self-segregation, of exclusiveness, and of supremacy. Sayegh elaborates this analysis, it's worth noting, before the June 1967 war, before Israel's subsequent occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Sayegh encourages us then to talk about Palestine in ways that account for state racisms, and indeed the histories of settler colonialism that animate them. That was 1965. How about today? To open that question, let me provide a contemporary definition of racism from critical geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Racism, Gilmore states, is, quote, the state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. Now, this definition of racism enables us to apprehend what Gilmore calls the application of violence, the cause of vulnerabilities to premature death. And scholars often leave Gilmore's definition here. But there's a bit more, as you can see on the slide, and a bit more that I think is especially salient for our discussion today, particularly for thinking about the relationship of the United States to Israel and Palestine. These fatal couplings of power and difference, Gilmore continues, take place in, quote, distinct yet densely interconnected political geographies, end quote. Okay. So, a demographic overview of the peoples living between the river and the sea reveals a heterogeneous population of about 15 million. A vital mixture of people with different faiths and languages and countries of origin. At the end of 2022, the State of Israel counted a population of approximately 9.7 million people. According to Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, 7.1 million were counted as Jews. 513,000 were considered a variety of small minorities. quote unquote, non-Arab Christians, Druze, and, quote, persons not classified by religion in the state's population register. About 2 million were classified as, quote unquote, Arabs. Arab, you may know, replaced the category non-Jew in official statistics in 1995. The vast majority of this population, of course, identify as Palestinian, whose families have lived on the land since prior to Israel's establishment. Israel's Jewish population is further divided into broadly distinct backgrounds. While the state classifies people based on, quote unquote, continent of origin, the more meaningful social distinctions are between Mizrahi Jews, whose ancestry traces to Yemen, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, North Africa, and Southern Europe, and are about 45% of Israel's population. Ashkenazi Jews, whose ancestry traces to Western and Central Europe and the United States, and are about 32% of Israel's population. Soviet Jews, about 12% of Israel's population, and Ethiopian Jews, who are about 3% of Israel's population. At the end of 2022, the Central Bureau of Statistics for the State of Palestine counted just over 6.1 million people living in the occupied Palestinian territories. Approximately 3.2 million Palestinians and over 700,000 Jewish Israeli settlers lived in the West Bank, while roughly 2.2 million Palestinians lived in the Gaza Strip. Nearly half of the Palestinians counted by the Bureau were registered as refugees with the United Nations, with UNRWA, with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Over 7 million Palestinians were counted as residing outside Palestine, with the overwhelming majority living in refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. The above demography is riven by lines drawn out of the ethno-nationalist imaginaries of European colonial state-building projects of the 19th century. The vision of modern Israel emerged in the late 19th century as a sanctuary for Jews worldwide from widespread institutionalized violence, discrimination, and anti-Semitism. The state was established in 1948 in the immediate aftermath of anti-Jewish state and para-state violence and Nazi Germany's industrial genocide of European Jews. Of course, contemporary expressions of white supremacy continue to feature a discriminatory and sometimes fatal strain of anti-Jewish racism, as evident in the early 21st century resurgence of white nationalist groups and fears of the so-called Great Replacement. Such patterns of anti-Semitism are a changeful yet persistent feature of modern racial supremacist discourses and practices. In a world where Jews' minority status is routinely demonized, stigmatized, and vilified, Israel has offered, for some, a powerful structure to secure the political expression of Jewish self-determination. Moreover, interestingly, racial discrimination is prohibited by law in Israel. It's considered a criminal offense. And the state has made affirmative commitments to combat discrimination against Bedouins, Ethiopian Jews, and the Druze minority across an array of social spheres, including employment, civil service, health, and education. Israel's national culture has also touted non-Ashkenazi difference as a site for the expression of state multiculturalism and cultural inclusion. The above does not contradict an understanding of Israel as a settler colonial state project. An attunement to racism grasps the racialized logics animating how Israel's institutions, policies, and laws organize and differentially distribute territory, resources, vulnerabilities, and life chances along seemingly immutable lines of human difference. Who can own and inherit land? Who can marry whom? Who is protected by the state and who is vulnerable to its violence? Who can become naturalized? Who can immigrate? Who can seek asylum? Who is imagined to belong? Answers to all of these questions pivot around historically sedimented distinctions between Jew, non-Jew, and Palestinian. Now, the first distinction I want to unfold for us is a foundational split between Jew and non-Jew, what political scientist Ian Lustig terms the red thread, quote unquote, of Israel's demographic problem, end quote. The architects of colonial Zionism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were animated by a sense that the best way to address the prevalence of anti-Semitism for Jews as an embattled European minority was to create and maintain a singular national polity, importantly, in which Jews were the demographic majority. The land of Israel, a theological holy land inscribed in Judaic scripture and prayer, served as the movement's preferred site of settlement, even as the architects of the Zionist movement were driven by a mixture of secular, as well as some religious ideals, and some considered other places, Uganda, Argentina, among them as possible alternative sites for Jewish settlement. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 committed Britain to the settling of a Jewish national home in Palestine in particular. Britain's mandate for Palestine from 1922 to 1947 enshrined that commitment in colonial policies that facilitated and incentivized Jewish immigration. Zionist leaders like Arthur Rupin touted the physical and reproductive labor of Jewish settlement through the prevailing race science of the time, envisioning a resolutely modern project to, quote unquote, improve the race from the feminizing conditions of Jewish life in Europe, while protecting it from the ostensible non-modern practices of the Arab world. Key organizations like the Jewish National Fund facilitated Jewish-only settlement, labor, property, and agricultural policies. Stalwart Zionist Zev Jabotinsky advocated for an iron wall separation between Jews and non-Jews, while leaders of the kibbutzim and moshavim movements centered the, quote, conquest of Hebrew labor as paramount for economic development. This foundational distinction persists into the present in manifold ways. Now, geographical separation has also been one of colonial Zionism's key approaches to producing and maintaining a Jewish demographic majority. This leads to the second racialized distinction in Israel-Palestine, separating Israel as a sovereign Jewish state from non-Jewish Palestinians. Such a vision animated the UN's plan to partition Palestine in 1947 along ethno-nationalist lines. Israel's founding in 1948 and the ensuing Arab-Israeli war facilitated the Nakba, or catastrophe, namely the decimation of over 400 Palestinian villages and the displacement of over 750,000 native Palestinians. Those Palestinians who remained within the new state of Israel's borders were subject to a strict regime of military governance, distinct from the civil governance applied to Jewish Israelis, a two-tiered system that lasted for nearly 2 decades. Moreover, state planning, education, and infrastructural development has hinged to this day on whether a municipality is characterized as, quote, Arab, Jewish, or mixed. While a small number of, quote unquote, Arab Israeli political representatives have been elected into Israel's parliament, the Knesset, electoral campaigns for Jewish Israeli parties often seek to increase voter turnout by fear-mongering about greater Arab representation. In 2018, the Knesset codified a highly controversial basic law stating unequivocally that the, quote, exercise of the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people, end quote. In doing so, the Knesset effectively enshrined a second-class status for 1/5 of its citizenry. Now, separation has, of course, even been more pronounced beyond the so-called Green Line of the 1949 armistice. In the 1950s, the United Nations constructed a network of ostensibly temporary refugee camps in the region to house displaced Palestinians. The UN has also enshrined a right of return for those Palestinians displaced in 1948 and their descendants. This is, of course, UN Resolution 194. The State of Israel has refused to recognize that right, while routinely facilitating Jewish immigration under its so-called law of return. The result is that Palestinians compose one of the largest and longest-standing refugee populations in the world. Indeed, as the world has been reminded in the last 4 months, well over half of Gaza's residents are refugees or direct descendants of refugees from the 1948 and 1967 wars. The war of 1967 between Israel, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan resulted in Israel occupying and expanding its sovereignty over the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, the Sinai Peninsula, and East Jerusalem. Desires to expand the territory of a greater Israel have enlarged the number of Palestinians for whom the Israeli state, as an occupying power under international law, is and remains ultimately responsible. Since 1967, Palestinian residents of the occupied territories have been subject to military occupation, to fragmentation, to enclosure. And while the Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt in 1973, Israel has retained preeminent control over the passage of people, goods, and natural resources, including food and water, into and out of all other territories that it's occupied since 1967. The Oslo Accords, signed in 1993 as an ostensible roadmap for a future of two states living in peace, also facilitated the carving of the West Bank into an archipelago of striated territories in which non-Jewish residents are governed by a different body of law than their Jewish Israeli counterparts. Some areas are nominally administered by the Palestinian Authority under Israeli supervision. Others are jointly administered by Israel and the PA, and roughly 60%, where Israel's Jewish settlers reside, is administered solely by Israel. Palestinians in the West Bank are subject to scores of Israeli checkpoints and hundreds of roadblocks and other obstacles to movement, including a 700-kilometer separation barrier deemed illegal by the International Court of Justice in the early 2000s, while Israeli settlers can move with relative ease. Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip are subject, of course, to an even more brutal form of spatial sequestration. After Israel dismantled Gaza's Jewish settlements in 2005, and Palestinians elected Hamas into government in 2006, and Hamas seized leadership in Gaza in 2007, Israel imposed a debilitating blockade on the Gaza Strip. In the 16 years since, Palestinian access to land, air, and sea, to agriculture and fishing and food and water supplies, to building materials and electricity have been severely curtailed. The result is a population of now 2.3 million people, subject to a litany of fatal forms of collective punishment, including military operations in 2008 and 9, 2014, 2018, 2021, and now 2023 and 24. Briefly, the third racialized distinction that I want to unfold for us, cutting across Israel-Palestine, is a little different from the other two in that it cleaves Jews of European and American descent from non-European Jews. Scholars in the field of Mizrahi studies term this cleavage intra-Jewish racism. This cleavage is obscured when focusing solely on Israelis and Palestinians, and has largely been marginalized in US and European discourses, limiting analyses of the ways racialized difference is overlaid by matters of, among other things, class and capital in Israel-Palestine. The Zionist movement of the first half of the 20th century was overwhelmingly led by and addressed to Jews in Central and Western Europe, Ashkenazi Jews, many of whom spoke Yiddish. Soon after the state was founded, Arabic and Persian-speaking Jews from Yemen, Iraq, Egypt, Morocco, Iran, and elsewhere immigrated to Israel. Some had been driven out of their homes by local regimes, while others were forcibly brought to Israel under the auspices of the new government as a source of cheap labor. Recognizing how they were minoritized in policy and practice, Mizrahim often opposed Israel's Ashkenazi-centric institutions, and in so doing challenged the state's racialized class divisions. In the early 70s, for example, some Mizrahi Jews organized as the Israeli Black Panthers to protest the poor schools, housing, and job opportunities offered them by the state. The 1977 and 1981 elections of Menachem Begin, who we met earlier briefly, as Israel's first prime minister from a party other than the Labor Party, was driven significantly by Mizrahi support. Begin leveraged the frustration felt by many working-class Mizrahim about their degrading treatment at the hands of elite Ashkenazi institutions. The promise of inexpensive quality housing in Jewish settlements in the West Bank deepened Mizrahi commitments to a vision of greater Israel and exacerbated racialized disdain for Palestinians. Such conditions continue to obtain until today. Now, scholars, organizers, and activists have long seen the racialized divisions underwriting life worlds in Israel-Palestine as fundamental obstacles to human flourishing. Prior to 1948, non-Zionist and anti-Zionist visions for modern Jewish flourishing were not uncommon, nor were visions of binationalism uncommon among Jewish intellectuals in particular. Israeli and Palestinian communist political parties have frequently advocated for secular democracy in the region. As discussed earlier, scholars in the Beirut-based Palestine Research Center theorized the racial character organizing the ideologies and practices of Zionist settlement and Israeli rule as a way to work towards Palestinian freedom. By 1975, the PRC's analysis undergirded the argument made before the United Nations that Zionism was a form of racism and racial discrimination. More recent movements for Palestinian freedom have been inspired by a wide range of internationalist, anti-racist, and anti-colonial visions, including the Black freedom struggle in the United States, international movements to combat apartheid in South Africa, and mobilizations for indigenous resurgence. But by way of closing, if you'll permit me, let's return to 1982 and invite us to listen together to the sound of silence breaking. Let us listen to June Jordan reading her poem, Moving Towards Home, written in the immediate aftermath of the massacres in the Palestinian refugee camps, written with witness, with desire, with futurity at the fore. So I'll close with playing a recording of Jordan's reading, and I'll look forward to discussion afterwards. Yeah? Okay. Let's see if this will work. Let's see.
Where is Ussama Makdisi? Who will bring me my loved one? New York Times, 9/2022. I do not wish to speak about the bulldozer and the red dirt, not quite covering all of the gardens and lands. Nor do I wish to speak about the nightfall screams that reach the observation posts where soldiers lounge around. Nor do I wish to speak about the woman who shoved her baby into the stranger's hands before she was led away. Nor do I wish to speak about the father whose sons were shot through the head while they slit his own throat before the eyes of his brethren. Nor do I wish to speak about the army that lit continuous flares into the darkness so that their flunkies could see the backs of the victims lying against the wall. Nor do I wish to speak about the pile of bodies and the stench that will not float. Nor do I wish to speak about the nurse again and again raped before they murdered her on the hospital. Nor do I wish to speak about the rattling bullets that did not halt on that keening trajectory. Nor do I wish to speak about the pounding of the doors and the breaking of windows and the hauling of families into the world of the dead. I do not wish to speak about the bulldozer and the red dirt, not quite covering all the crimes and myths. Because I do not wish to speak about unspeakable things that must follow from those who dare to purify, those who dare to exterminate, those who dare to describe human beings as beasts with 2 legs, those who dare to mop up, to tighten the noose, to step up the military pressure, to ring around civilian streets with tents. Those who dare to close universities, to abolish the press, to kill the elected representatives of the people who refuse to be purified. These are the ones from whom we must redeem the words of our King, the words of our God. Because I need to speak about hope. I need to speak about living where the land is not bullied and beaten into a tombstone. I need to speak about living where the talk will take place in my language. I need to speak about living where my children will grow without harm. I need to speak about living where the men of my family between the ages of 6 and 65 are not marched into a roundup that leads to the grave. I need to talk about living where I can sit without grief, without boiling around the wild homes, where I must not ask where is our good father, because he moved there beside me. I need to talk about him, because I need to talk about home. I was born a black woman, and now I am become Palestinian. Against the relentless laughter, there is less and less pain, and here are my words. It is time to make a living.
Thanks, y'all.
Okay, so apparently there are questions going around or cards going around. Please fill out the cards with any questions you may have. And so I would like to start by thanking both Professor Bazian and Professor Feldman for these two fantastic lectures that actually overlap quite nicely and of course reinforce each other. Hatem, if I may Hatem, Professor Bazian Hatem began, by quoting from Edward Said and then going on to talk about Jack Shaheen, sort of talking about a well-known, well-documented, quite deep and dense history of Orientalism and anti-Palestinian representation, anti-Muslim representation, anti-Arab representation, and talked about Islamophobia as a variety of Orientalism. And so the questions, and Keith, of course, Professor Feldman, Keith, talked about state racism and the natural affinity that various oppressed and marginalized groups have been or are developing or have developed in the face of state racism that's both excluded Black Americans here in this country, as well as, of course, Palestinians in Israel. But then there's a variety of other forms of exclusion, including Mizrahi Jews, as he mentioned at the end. So let me start with, as we're waiting for the questions to come up, the questions I have for both of you are the following, and maybe we could start with an answer to these questions and then move on to the questions of the audience. The first question for Hatem and for Keith is the anti-Palestinian aspect of Orientalism, the extraordinary racism that persists until today and that we see all around us today, is that at the core of modern contemporary Islamophobia, would you say? In other words, is there a way of disaggregating the anti-Palestinian aspect from the broader and maybe perhaps even older Islamophobic discourse? Because Islamophobia can go back, centuries, and of course there are parts of the world, Afghanistan, others that are not Palestinian. But the sheer vehemence and persistence in this country seems to be more directed at the Palestinian aspect rather than at the Islamic. In other words, the United States can co-opt Islam, as you said. It can co-opt Islam, but it's more difficult to co-opt Palestinians. And so maybe you could think about that. You mentioned, Hatem, the rise of what you call very provocatively Muslim Zionists. And I'm wondering, what is the relationship between Muslim Zionism and Arab Zionism of the official states? Can you sort of elaborate on this point? And that brings me to the points that Keith made, because it seems to me that the use of Muslim Zionists, or the recourse of Muslim Zionists and Arab Zionists, in other words, using people who are allegedly authentic spokesmen for their peoples or communities or religions, whether it's Islam or Palestinian or Arab, using them to reaffirm an extraordinarily racist set of dehumanization and Orientalism towards Palestinians. How does that work, and how is that different from the standard issue of Orientalism that you talked about, Hatem, in your talk? Why, in other words, the turn to Muslim Zionism today, and how is that different? And that brings me to Keith's really excellent talk as well, where Keith, you started and ended with this very evocative moment of post-Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which I happened to live through, by the way. And this really, very, very powerful discussion that you elaborated. The silence is broken. This opinion or editorial or opening by Jack O'Dell, and then you ended your talk with the reading of June Jordan's famous poem in 1982, to which, of course, June Jordan was subjected to a backlash, if I remember correctly. That's right. And so the question I have for you is what does this again, because this builds on Hatem's point about Muslim Zionism, Arab Zionism, so-called, in quotation marks, there's also Black Zionism. And so I'm wondering how your presentation, which sort of shows us this arc of breaking the silence from 1982 to where we are today, but what about the role of a much older discourse of Black Zionism that continues also, in a sense, until today, with the Congressional Black Caucus, for example, with Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader, who's visited Israel on 5 separate AIPAC-sponsored trips. Where does this fit into the story? Is it a question of, is one diminishing and one on the ascendancy? Keith, how do we make sense? Because there is, of course, state-sponsored, there is racism, obviously, and there's state-sponsored racism, and there is this, and you talked about Ruth Wilson Gilmore's very powerful definition of racism. Everything you said makes perfect sense, but then how do we explain this other persistence, and how, do you see what I'm saying? And how does that relate to your optimistic, I hope, story ending with June Jordan? But June Jordan was in 1982, and here we are in 2024, and there's a genocide unfolding, and yet there is still extraordinary silence. But is there silence? Because the AME's, Council of Bishops came out with a statement last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago. So things are changing, but can you elaborate a little bit more and relate Black Zionism to the rising sort of solidarity with Palestinians, and same for Hatem, Muslim Zionism, but also obviously there's an extraordinary Muslim solidarity with Palestinians, and of course there's Arab solidarity. So that's where I would start. Thank you, and then we're waiting for questions to come. Thanks.
So let me begin, and most likely we're going to take more time than the allotted time. The question of Islamophobia and anti-Palestinianism as a driving force of Islamophobia in the American context. Islamophobia has many tributaries, and I think the state as a major producer of Islamophobia is given. The neoconservative, the evangelicals, the interventionist right, the interventionist left, and also Arab and Muslim states in that. But when we come to the Islamophobia industry, in an article that I wrote in the American Studies Association, my estimate based on tax returns, 990 and so on, approximately 70% of the funding for the Islamophobia industry in the United States comes from pro-Israel sources. And at the helm of the organizational infrastructure of the Islamophobia industry are major Zionists as well as pro-Zionist evangelicals that are laser focused on Palestine. Part of the rest of my talk was about 9/11. The infrastructure of anti-terrorism laser focused on Palestinian civil society organizations and individuals in the United States and in Europe. To the estimate, again, I chair the MLFA, Muslim Legal Fund of America. Our estimate is almost 90% of the legal cases post 9/11 targeted Palestinians. Entangled them as a way, whether it's material support, financial transaction to the charitable organization, targeting, surveillance, and so on. So I'd say it would be very difficult to actually disentangle anti-Palestinianism within the Islamophobic landscape in the United States from the pro-Israel infrastructure and the organizational infrastructure that have pursued it. More importantly, when we get into the actual trainings for so-called global war on terrorism, Israel became the go-to expert because they reoriented themselves in the post-Cold War era, including building 2 full Orientalist cities to train U.S. military because Israel gained some skill in the invasion of Jenin to prepare for U.S. forces both in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and how to accustom soldiers to engage in urban warfare while the Adhan is in the background. This extended to the Urban Shield, which was run here in Alameda, that brought the Israeli forces, and some of my students actually were part of the civilian volunteers, and they gave them to read Arabic statements as to act as hostages. This included a reenactment of taking over the bridge and how counterterrorism operations will take place. So I would say that Islamophobia in the American context laser focus on the Palestinian subject and derailing and targeting Palestinian activist civil organization. To the extent between 2001 and 2009, it would have been impossible, or at least you could count the number of mosques that will host a Palestine talk because of the fear of the intervention of the security state that was operating within the Islamophobic discourse. So that's one in terms of the first question. As to the category of the Muslim Zionists, we had a conference in Chile that had a discussion about Christian Zionism, Jewish Zionism, and my part was to conceptualize Muslim Zionism. And this is to try to understand the machineries that have begun to unfold, where as the Abrahamic Accords were being laid into projects and programs of how to create a Muslim leadership that is amenable to Zionism and begin to offer religious interpretation, right? Fatwas that would actually make the Abrahamic Accords a normative pattern. And in that, they resorted, one, in what I consider to be imperial Islam, of a state-sponsored religion, and on the other, utilizing similarly a Sufism that it likewise articulated its way of engaging with Israel and Zionism on that. To understand, can we differentiate or at least put a fork with the Arab Zionists and the Muslim Zionists? I think they co-constitute themselves, with possibly both the United Arab Emirates being at one focal point and Egypt as another. And now Saudi Arabia is entering into the fold, inveighing for how to actually bring global Muslim institutional framework to accept Zionism, normalize Israel, and engage within it, while laying to waste any type of opposition that would be there in the Muslim world. Now, this is at a time where we find the Muslim regular person, if you want to say, in the millions would be in support, if not in the 90th percentile, if not more. But if you notice, the smallest demonstrations in terms of mass is actually across the Muslim world, with the possible exceptions of Jordan, because of the decisively large number of Palestinians, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Pakistan, out of 57 majority states.
And Yemen.
And Yemen in that sense. Most of the state apparatus was far more focused on the Asia Cup rather than the genocide. And that, again, for me, is where Muslim Zionism that utilizes the text in order to rationalize the Abrahamic Accords and the creating of the alternative leadership. Interesting enough, it builds on Cheryl Bernard's Civil Democratic Islam of the Rand Corporation report post 9/11. So in essence, it's actually a variety of it that centers and puts Islam as a major tool in the Abrahamic Accords and folding in the region.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, got my brain going. It's wonderful. And thank you for your great questions. I will, and I'm keen to hear what other kinds of questions have surfaced from our remarks. So I think the first thing I would say, and sort of in this question that you raise, Ussama, about Black Zionism, is to suggest that there's no natural affinity towards anti-racism. Groups aren't naturally drawn to committing themselves to anti-racist projects. Groups are heterogeneous, super heterogeneous mix of wide range of political orientations, commitments, and the like. And so, there's a long-standing strain of what some scholars would call Afro-Zionism, right? That actually precedes 1948 by a good measure, and you have sort of founding figures in Pan-Africanist thought like Edward Wilmot Blyden in the early 20th century, articulating an avowed Afro-Zionism that's thinking alongside Herzl, that's impressed by Herzl, that's drawn to the possibilities of articulating a different kind of freedom, than the one on offer in in Blyden's case in the colonized Caribbean. I brought up David Graham Du Bois and Shirley in Cairo in the 1960s. In many ways, they're a departure from a kind of Du Boisian line, where W.E.B. Du Bois himself is sort of a profound for up until really the 1956 war. Was a profound architect and arbiter of Zionism, and saw the Jewish Zionist project in Palestine as a model in many ways. So there's nothing natural about a particular kind of political worldview. I'll also say that part of what I find so interesting about the 1982 moment is that it's a moment of instability and disequilibrium in the US context, where in a different kind of way, visions of Palestine and the struggle for Palestinian rights are becoming visible in kind of after the end of the sort of flourishing of the sort of the anti-colonial moment in US civil rights history, and in this more robust kind of neoconservative backlash moment. So that's what I find so profound about June Jordan and Freedom Way, folks in Freedom Ways, this coalition that emerges, the November 29th coalition, which November 29th is the UN's Day of Solidarity with the Palestinians, hence the name, all of whom are beginning to think really concretely about the connections between sort of late Cold War US foreign policy and a sort of a recrudescent white supremacist-oriented domestic policy, right? And yeah, most of them get hammered politically, right? June Jordan gets lambasted and loses friends, and Carol Haddad, who speaks at this NWSA conference. The trouble that was caused at the NWSA conference by this moment was extraordinary, right? So, I mean, the last thing I'm interested in, and I'm glad you're a historian to help us think about it, is sort of how to think about the continuous breaking of silences, right? We can think about 67 and SNCC and the Black Panther Party and the Arab American University graduates and the sort of flourishing of breaking the silence in the late 60s, or in this late 80s moment, right? Or in the moment right after 9/11, or after 2014 and Ferguson, Gaza, or in 2021 when we saw this incredible flourishing of sort of BLM activism and activism contesting the previous bombardment of Gaza and the dispossession that was happening in Sheikh Jarrah, or this contemporary moment. Clearly, I mean, there's one way to narrate a series of silences and speech acts, but maybe that's not the only framing that might be helpful. So I'd be curious. Maybe at some point.
Well, I mean, this is for you. I mean, how long do we have until 6? Is that 10 more minutes? So let me just ask, so it sounds like there's a history of don't take solidarity for granted, at the same time narrate continuous acts of solidarity despite the continual oppression and Orientalism. All right, so let me ask a question each, and then, because there's several questions, for Keith, or for both of you. I mean, it's not clear who this is addressed to, but the question is as follows, and I'm reading verbatim for the record. How does the exclusivity of Israel to Jews and the advocacy of diversity and multiculturalism in the West by international Zionist organizations advance the displacement of Arabs in the Levant and the integration of Jews in Western society? I'm not sure if I understood the question entirely, but that is a question addressed to both of you, I guess. Multiculturalism and I guess Zionism.
Yeah.
Is if I put it in different terms.
I'll take it super quickly. I mean, something that I tried to elaborate just a little bit in my remarks is that multiculturalism and settler colonialism are not contradictory logics and structures as we sit in a multicultural settler colonial state and have this conversation today, right? And so you can see in many regards the ways in which an incorporation of a wide range of cultural difference can take place through the rubrics of rights, through the rubrics even of anti-discrimination. It was an interesting sort of chuckle moment in the conversation when, noting Israel has criminalized racial discrimination. Right? That can take place, and there can be a systematic exclusion of an indigenous population from the polity. Those two, at the political level, right? Those two are not contradictory. They actually operate together. And I think the U.S. has provided, I think, many people in recent years a way of understanding how multicultural inclusion and settler colonial dispossession are congruent processes.
Okay. Yeah. It's a question that I'm thinking about because implied in the question is a collapsing of the Jewish progressive experience line with the Zionist American line. And those are not actually mutually constitutive. These are two separate trajectories. So it would be accurate to say there's a long history of progressive Jewish engagement in pushing for inclusion, diversity, challenging the power. And these were targeted again from the 1914 period through the Palmer raids, through the FBI, through the labor movement targeting of Jewish progressives. But simultaneously, we have a strong anti-inclusion and anti-diversity, especially as Israel becomes a focal point of the organized segments of American Zionist Jewish community. And in here, I would bring the ADL as possibly being one of the most repressive agencies in attempting to craft a particular notion of diversity and inclusion, a diversity and inclusion within power, rather than challenging or undermining power. Remind people that affirmative action, the first challenge to affirmative action, takes place immediately in 1969 by the New York Teachers Union, and that ADL is actually writes or supports the challenge to affirmative action. So affirmative action gets into the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So the first challenge literally 4 years thereafter, 69. And then the major case, 1978, which is the Bakke decision in California, which was a UC Davis medical school, a student admitted to school, and the ADL likewise actually was a participant in opposing the affirmative action. Taken back a little bit earlier, the ADL also participated in the Hollywood blacklisting and making sure that progressive actors, directors, and so on literally adhere to the McCarthyist era and push forward to the ADL actually working to derail Arab Palestinian organizing nationally, including in the Bay Area, where in 1992, the San Francisco District Attorney, Arlo Smith, raided the ADL offices in San Francisco and also the ADL offices in LA. The documents that they gained showed that the ADL spied on every progressive organization that existed in the Bay Area. And one of the, I have all the files still from that case. The ADL sent an undercover paid informant into the Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee and the Spring Mobilization for Peace, Jobs, and Justice to be data entry. And this person collected the data and handed it to the ADL. The ADL worked with the San Francisco police officer. The undercover informant is Roy Bullock. The police officer, Tom Gerard, who ran the information and the license plate of these activists with the police department. And the ADL actually had files on individuals, almost 700 organizations and files of individuals. So this inclusion diversity, I would say we have to separate and speak of the categories. Lastly, the most recent attack on model ethnic studies curriculum brought some of the, what I consider to be anti-diversity inclusions one in the curriculum, ADL among them, JCRC, ADC, the American Hindu Foundation and others, in torpedoing the model ethnic studies. And I know Keith is very well aware of this. And the campaign, again, symbolic inclusion might be actually work, but power and change of the table and who's sitting on the table, we're still far, far away. Progressive Jews continue to play a major role. Establishment Zionist organizations have been at the forefront of derailing that effort.
So last questions, just two questions, and you can each answer them briefly. Hatem, and I guess Keith as well, do you have thoughts of what a positive representation of Palestinians, Arabs, and Western media could look like? Is such a thing possible? And what films would you recommend if there is such a thing featuring Palestinian stories? That's one question, and that's for both of you. And the last question, I guess, is a huge, broad one. What can we do beyond words and awareness? So those are the last two questions. We're almost out of time, so Hatem briefly, and then Keith.
Well, that's a very difficult how to actually think, but let me say the one. You have to organize and you have to get your say forward. We need to begin actually on the faculty level. You know that in the UC system we have about a total of 15 Palestinian faculty members. The fact that you don't have teachers and professors that teach the next generation is part of the problem. So that is one. The second is we need actually more and more of our people and supporters to take on the media, to take on film, to take on productions, to take on narrating your own story. So that's also part of changing the landscape. Requires also investment, that we need to have investment collectively and across sectors. On the positive end, there is a number of good movies that are created by Palestinians. I don't have the long list, but I know that I'm actually going to try to bring The Teacher, which is just a recently released film by Farah Nabulsi. So hopefully we'll be able to get it, maybe if not late spring, next fall, to be screened in here. It's a really a good movie to see. Farah and a host of other media and film producers are coming to the fore, and I think what we need is to create the landscape for them to land. Lastly, I do encourage people to actually begin to put theater pieces. There's so much coming out of Gaza for people to be creative, to put theater pieces, both in terms of public and so on. Not that I'm opposed to, I'm always for blocking the streets anytime I'm in, right? But I do think we have to actually engage in different areas and different sectors. And one of the areas that I see is literally almost vacant but ready for our work is the theater pieces that we could put out. I'm thinking of the mime troupe that used to do a lot of theater here in the public parks and so on. So I think we need to think of those groups and maybe some of the individuals who have screenwriting skills and writing, theater pieces. I think we need to cultivate those. I'm not from those. I'm more of an, protest and so on. But for those to actually come forth in order for us to bring that into fruition.
Thank you. The last word is to Sheikh.
Oh, sheesh. So, two great and very, very distinct questions. I would distinguish positive Palestinian representation and maybe push against just this notion that they're positive and negative forms of representation, and just say, let's find complex, fully human, fully rendered representations of Palestinian life and experience and history. And we have there's an ample history of Palestinian cinema that has no end for our opportunities to think with and be exposed to the complexity of Palestinian life and experience. And if you like Netflix and you like comedy, check out Mo Amer. He's pretty funny. Mo? Any Mo fans in the room? Okay, yeah, a handful. Great. The other thing I'd say about words and awareness, it's a big question, and I just want to put in a plug for words and awareness. Having the words to be able to describe accurately, effectively, critically what's going on in this moment. Have the words to be able to see how words themselves are getting turned and twisted and weaponized and delinked from their meaning and abstracted. Having the words like June Jordan attempted, right, to bear witness and imagine something otherwise. That's really powerful work. That's essential work. That's work that's part of any robust political imagination. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you both, and thank you to the audience and the organizers.